Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Bogan Intelligentsia. Today, we're rejoined by Dr. Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at QUT, who's joining us to speak about the recent US-China trade talks in Madrid, China's recent 80th anniversary of World War II, the regional presence of world leaders, particularly Indonesia, some of the implications of that. We also look at how Australia interfaces with this changing region. With no further ado, please enjoy this fascinating discussion with Dr. Warwick Powell. Thanks for coming on board again, Warwick Powell. Very good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too, Joel.
I just wouldn't mind starting this off, eventually getting on to the World War II anniversary in China, but would like to kick this off with the US-China trade talks in Madrid. Have slipped underneath the radar due to the maelstrom of news coming through at the moment. And I was just wondering if you could take us through those trade negotiations that concluded. Essentially, we heard a lot about TikTok and about some framework regarding that. So if you could just explain a little bit what happened at the trade talks, if there was any significant trade talk actually spoken about other than TikTok.
I think the TikTok discussions took place in the context of some other issues related to mainly US restrictions on certain technology exports, as well as some broader discussions around barriers to investment both ways. So I think what you'll see is that we've had three sets of talks now, right, since the temporary truce was initiated. And those three sets of talks have each tackled a little tangible bracket of issues. The first ones really was just to try and stabilize where things were at. So they agreed basically on winding the clock back to 1st of April and enabling that as a foundation position. The second talks then came up with a framework to move things forward. So again, that was very process oriented. Though clearly there were some discussions around things like rare earths, which some practical agreements were entered into. And then this set of talks, I think, tackled obviously TikTok, which has been an issue now for the administration, for US administration, for more than 8 months, and also again the wider issues of investment. Okay, so now again we've got another set of issues on the table. The information's quite light, so I've read President Trump's tweet, which is his usual way of telling the world about something, and it's light on detail. I've listened to the remarks from the China side as well, which is also light on detail per se. And I guess my take away at the moment is that, like most things, the complexity of the issues at play have required the parties to firstly agree on how things are to be tackled, and then agree on the parameters of the discussions. In other words, narrow the issues. What are the issues that we're going to be addressing in these particular discussions?
Mm.
And have a way then of moving that forward. Because if two sides to a discussion can't even agree on the agenda and how that's going to happen, then you're never actually going to make meaningful headway. So I think the issues have been, I think a whole bunch of issues were identified early, some months ago. A framework was put into place, which then created the rails along which these discussions would travel. And now we're starting to dive into individual sets of issues, but again, with a very similar dynamic, which is let's agree the issues, let's agree a way of dealing with the issues, let's agree a framework, and then tackle them in that sort of systematic kind of way. I don't know what the outcome is in relation to TikTok. I wasn't a fly on the wall. So I guess time's going to tell. The Chinese side talk about a framework agreement. The American side tends to have a little bit more hyperbole about, um, what some deal, but we don't know.
And, there's issues regarding national security concerns that Washington are flagging, right, around data and algorithms and things like that. Um, it's just an interesting thing because you got the Nvidia semiconductor thing flying behind the background, which seems so much more significant. But the TikTok thing leads, as I suppose there's a bit of a public interest in it and things like that. But can you just maybe explain to the audience a little bit more why it's so pressing to Washington, this TikTok issue at the moment, and why it may appear to sort of trump maybe some of these more consequential issues like the stalemate around the Nvidia chip fiasco and things like that?
Well, TikTok is the subject of a congressional ban, which the president has been able to suspend, and he's done that on a number of occasions. So it's an issue that, without being addressed, will either become subject to the congressionally legislative ban at some point, which has, I think, significant domestic political implications, as well as ripple effects in relation to the United States-China dynamic. And also, you've got to remember that President Trump, when he originally suspended the, um, the the ban, did so on the basis that he was in a position to cut a deal, and that was meant to happen quickly. That somehow, a group of Americans would buy TikTok. That hasn't happened.
Just like the wars stopping, yeah, a lot of things.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the issues that involve nation states um, are of an order of magnitude quite different and quite complex compared to commercial dealings around land, for example. And there's a lot more layers involved, which invariably means that these issues take a lot longer to work through, right? They're simply not things that you can resolve with a click of a finger per se. And even when principles are agreed to at a leadership level, the extent to which those principles are then relayed through the system to become reality, that's very variable as well. There's a lot that can go wrong between leaders agreeing a principle and something actually happening. And I think from a Chinese point of view, they're very mindful that you've got to not only agree the principal issues, which leaders do, but you've got to make sure that you can convert all of that into reality. And they're very mindful that reality is just a lot messier and more complicated. And I think that the political dynamics of an American electoral cycle always lends itself to somewhat grandiose claims about problem solving and being able to do things quickly. And I think also that the American political culture, particularly these days with social media playing such a dominant role in its engagement with the voting community, demands almost instantaneous gratification. And so the political world is having to, in a sense, try to go with the flow on that. And reality just doesn't play by those rules, especially when you're dealing with other countries.
And maybe going through what just happened in Nepal there, a little bit of an example of that element at play in society. But back to the Trump sort of scenario there. What you point out is kind of interesting because there was more patience in the cabin of the Trump White House in the first term. There's going to be a bit more sort of geostrategic patience, But now it's kind of evaporating, and we're really seeing that Queen's real estate, a lazy sort of approach to it, just smashing against the cold hard rocks of geopolitical reality, right? Like yeah, and the frustration is kind of mounting, and it's just sort of mounting as steam, as opposed to the cold hard reality on the ground. Now, via the chips, and that we that 7 nm chip advancement in China with Huawei. There was a response to the Chips Act under Biden that's kind of changed the whole semiconductor world. And just before we move on to the World War II anniversary, I just wonder if you could sort of explain a little bit about that status quo now and how it might be affecting US outlooks and behavior in the Trump administration right now.
Well, you set this against sort of the last 10 years or so of very conscious efforts now, I think, from the United States of various administrations to try and contain China's growth, particularly through restrictions of certain technology products, semiconductors in particular. And I think the the experience, I guess, in Washington is one of deep frustration. So, and it's not just in relation to the effects of the export restrictions insofar as China's own development is concerned, but in other areas too, whether it's, in particular, the sanctions leveled at Russia in the last 3 years have simply not delivered on the anticipated results. All of this is putting incredible pressure on Washington politically because at some point, those who came with you on the journey on the basis of certain sets of promises begin to get very disappointed.
Mhm.
And as those disappointments set in, and then as in fact things get worse, big questions emerge about whether or not um, this administration's up to the challenges that confront America today, whether in fact they've framed or analysed the environment correctly, all come into focus. And uh, I get the sense that there continues to be a strong debate and uncertainty inside the Beltway in Washington as to the state of the world that the US finds itself in. There are those who cling to the idea that American primacy and hegemony remains the dominant theme and can be given effect to. And you see that particularly in things like the the proposed legislation on the so-called bone crunching sanctions that have been advanced by a couple of senators, Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham. They, in a sense, reflect this idea that the United States can ultimately dictate the fortunes of others. So Lindsey Graham talks about crushing the Russian economy and all this sort of stuff. Um, I think at the same time, there are others in the administration who have a very different view of reality, and that is that the United States is no longer in the position that it once was and can't, through its own will, dictate the fortunes of others, let alone its own fortunes. And we're starting to see that in areas like technology policy, the whole approach to the tariffs, which again didn't see that 70, 80 nations lining up to pucker up and cut deals, so to speak, with the United States. It just hasn't happened, right? So the world, in many regards, hasn't unfolded in the ways that Washington perhaps intuitively expects the world to behave, and and so frustrations are boiling over. There are arguments about what should or shouldn't be priorities now. So much so that we've had reports in Politico, for example, about a draft defense strategy paper, which suggests that perhaps the United States is going to more or less turn its entire attention to the Western Hemisphere, which is the American continent, basically, North and South, at the expense of its ambitions in other parts of the world. I don't know whether the War Secretary, Pete Hegseth, will necessarily buy all of that and go down that path, but you can see that these debates are now happening in Washington, and they're discussions that 5 years ago you would think would be impossible to be happening.
I've been spoken about a couple of times as the Monroe 2.0 sort of happening, and we're seeing another boat overnight getting struck without any evidence of anything on it off the Venezuelan coast, and this naval blockade kind of indicates, maybe a push towards this region. I even heard an academic the other night based in Canada speaking to the long-term viability of Canada as well in this new sort of environment. So it's an interesting point of view. They both have bad outcomes, I suppose, for the people interacting with the United States here. But this sort of is a good time to point. I mean, you're seeing that a strategic retreat potentially on the table there, and it's a good time to speak about that incredible footage with a guest list to boot at the anniversary for the ending of World War II there. I'd just like to, if you could just sort of explain a little bit about the significance of this event. And, the West might have framed it as a little bit of an axis of evil, an emerging axis of evil with, front and center Kim and Putin and Xi, followed by the rest of the global South and the developing world. So, I was just wondering if you could just explain a little bit about the initial significance of it, and, potentially how China and Russia in its previous ceremony only held, a month earlier, if they're trying to reset the narrative a little bit about World War II as well there, and kind of challenge the historical narrative held by the West about their, the significance of their involvement.
Well, 80 years is a significant anniversary, right? So it's not surprising that countries will conduct celebrations or events that acknowledge that as an important anniversary of an important event. And I think the military parade in Beijing, which is what you're talking about, reflected the significance of this being the 80th anniversary as opposed to the 79th or the 81st. So that's probably the first thing to say, is that I think it just reflects the sense that human beings have to the significance of anniversaries, of decile-based anniversaries. The second thing, though, as you say, is that there is an important impact on narratives. And I think the first one is for China and Chinese people themselves to reclaim the narrative of their own experiences. So again, the first purpose is a domestic one, which is to acknowledge the experiences that China and Chinese people went through between 1931 and 1945 in responding to 14 years of Japanese aggression. That was the first thing. So from China's perspective, this experience was one of defending national survival over a decade and a half almost from Japanese aggression. The fact that this experience intersected with a wider global war against fascism, I guess, lends an international significance to China's own experiences. And China does want to be acknowledged for the role it played in the ultimate defeat of Japanese fascism, and as a result of that, also global fascism. Chinese people went through, 14 years of war with Japan, the Imperial Army, and over that period lost somewhere between 25 and 35 million people through a combination of being killed in war itself, as well as indirectly as a result of famine and disease. That's not an insignificant number of people, particularly given that the Soviets also lost about 26 million, which is substantially more than any other nation lost. In saying that, of course, it doesn't diminish the fact that every nation that lost people in these wars made significant sacrifices. It's simply to remind themselves and the world that they also had their own experiences and losses. So I guess that's the first thing. There has, of course, been, and perhaps only over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, been a much more concerted effort to focus global public narratives concerning the Second World War on the experiences of the West. And perhaps this speaks to the power of Hollywood in the way that it tells its stories and its principal audience, which of course is English speaking, and how that over time dominates the ways in which people think about the experiences of war and the Second World War in particular. Um, and
It's so true, Warwick. I mean, personally, all I did was grow up watching, in the era of, I suppose, the Spielberg films, Saving Private Ryan is a good one there. These, and then going back through the decades, watching these films with my dad or my grandfather, that all kind of rang out this message. And as someone who was interested in World War II as a young person and the history of World War II, I found there was such a blind spot there when it came to China. I mean, I'd heard of the rape of Nanking, and I looked into it, but as you say, that sort of decade and a half of struggle, it's just largely left off the history books. And I'd like to know, if after we continue, if you could speak a little bit to that film that was recently released commemorating that event, and how that might have had an effect on or added to the significance of this event.
Yeah, look, well, I'm fortunate to be here today because my grandfather escaped Shanghai when the Japanese came. So,
Yeah, well,
um, yeah, the movie, right? So, that was the Nanjing. I can't remember what it's called in English. Nanjing Zhaoxiangguan, which is the photographic studio of Nanjing. Right to whatever it is. Um, it's actually one of a number of movies that uh, have been or are about to be released this year, coinciding with the 80th anniversary. So there's that movie. There's one which is called uh, it's about the rescue of prisoners of war in the East China Sea. Um, uh, and that episode was when the Japanese had captured a bunch of mainly Western soldiers, English soldiers, and were taking them back towards Japan as prisoners of war. And the ship sunk, and uh, the prisoners of war, came into the water, and the Japanese were shooting them from the ship, but they were being rescued by a flotilla of Chinese fishermen. So that's what that story was about. And then there's a movie called 731, which was about the Japanese human laboratory testing facilities in northeast China, where a whole bunch of experiments, diseases and chemical experiments were done on people, on Chinese people. So three movies have come out, which really focuses in on China's experiences around different aspects of the war. The Nanjing movie is one of a number that have come out over, say, the last 15 years or so. So it's probably more well known for the Chinese audience as a key story, I guess, in national memory. And so these three movies have had a very strong galvanizing effect in China. Um, Interestingly, the feedback, and there was a lot of social media feedback, right, in China as a result of people going and seeing them, particularly the first movie. And a lot of people took their kids to see it, which I think was a big call. There are parts of the film which arguably are quite artistically and well done, but nonetheless quite violent. Um, People do say that the director, you know, used cinematographic tricks to, in a sense, allude to some of the violence without necessarily being so violent. But I mean, there were some pretty violent aspects to it all, and
Look, I remember kids being encouraged to be taken to Schindler's List back in the 90s, you know? Yeah.
yeah. And look, these are important things, I think, for generations to be able to take stock of, right? So, um, uh, I think broadly speaking, and this is a bit of a generalization because different people will have different relationships to the movie, and but broadly speaking, the reaction has been a consolidation of a strong anti-war sentiment amongst the Chinese population. China as a people have experienced a lot of warfare in recent times, and many people still have descendants who were, involved in the war. Very few are alive now. They're in their late 90s, and some of us, more than 100 years old. So there's not many still alive who fought in those wars, bearing in mind that it was 80 years ago, right? But there were some people who were, of course, born during that period in their 80s. And so there are a lot of Chinese families with connections to that era. Many have family members who died. And so it's quite a raw part of China's own experience coming through, a century's worth of enfeeblement and exploitation at the hands of various colonial um, powers, and ultimately to come out the other end after 1949. Because bear in mind that cutting through all of this was a civil war, right? So um, uh, the war against Japanese aggression took place against a backdrop where there was a civil war going on at the same time, and where the United Front, which was formed to fight Japan first, was fragile at best and often didn't hold, right? So often the Civil War would take precedence over the war against the Japanese. So it was a very bloody and tumultuous period in Chinese history, which I don't think anybody in China, would want to firstly revisit itself, and let alone have it visited upon other people. So in that regard, China's own experiences has reinforced a very deep sense of commitment to avoiding wars as much as it possibly can, which I guess then leads to the optics of the military parade. Um, this is probably the first military parade that many people in the West paid any attention to, right, in Beijing. But they have been run every year. Um,
Was
the
there a particular reason? Is it because of the chaotic, just literally the 12 months of Western sort of implosion that's made it more of an object? Or have some of these, the YJ-19s, the amphibious automated, prototypes and things like that, is it the technology, or is it the condition of the Western lens that's seeing this parade, as you say?
Oh, look, I think it's all of that. I mean, if there wasn't some of this new technology, then perhaps there'd be less hubbub about it all after the event. But there's a lot of attention paid to it, in part because it came on the back of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which took place a couple of days earlier. It's also come on the 80th anniversary, which is a significant anniversary in and of itself. There was some controversy around it because the Japanese sought to dissuade some countries from attending. So there was a little bit of, historical tension
But a
there as
former
well.
Japanese PM in present.
Who well, did attend. That's right.
Yes.
And of course there is the conflict in Ukraine, which for it's understandable that there are some people, particularly in Europe, who have very strong views about that. And Russia's President Putin attended both the SCO as the principal guest of honor of the military parade. Now, the military parade, in some ways, bookended um, a non-Western celebration, if you will, or acknowledgement of the victory in the Second World War, because in May this year, um, Russia hosted its own military parade to celebrate its own experiences and losses, and China's president attended that. And the Soviets and the Chinese combined lost somewhere between 50 and 60 million people. So in some regards, these are two nations and two civilizations that experienced massive losses and wanted to reclaim their own, as I mentioned earlier, their own sense of contribution and sacrifice. And I think that they successfully did that. Now, the fact that these are global events as well, and China invited a number of countries and their heads of state to join the celebration, I think just amplified how important this event was as a look. I guess I'd describe it as a filling out of the story again. Right? It's not about undermining the contributions that were made by whether they were Americans in the Pacific, certainly not of people in Malaya at the time, people in Indochina that fought valiantly, and of course, Australians. Um, Certainly, the role of Americans who contributed directly in China's fight against the Japanese has long been acknowledged. The Flying Tigers is part of that experience.
Mm.
So it's never really been at all about diminishing the contributions of others, but it's actually reasserting a place within the tapestry for the contributions and sacrifices of the Chinese, and of course, indirectly, the experiences of the Soviets as well. Because don't forget, the Soviets did come down from the north and played a very important role in fighting the Japanese in northern China. So there was a crossover as well. Um, the fact that a whole bunch of modern technologies that hadn't been seen before was on display, I think, drew quite a lot of attention. And again, that particularly matters in the current climate, right? So much is contextual. You could run a similar parade at a different period of history, and very few people would blink an eye. And in fact, if you look at the parade of 5 years ago, there's plenty of new technology on display, plenty of significant capability on display, but I don't think many people in the West paid any attention to it. So yeah, so there was a clear demonstration of capability. No two ways about it. There it was for an hour and a half or so. Not only drones, but I think more critically two other things, which was the intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear capabilities that could reach anywhere in the world. That's it's a scary but an important reminder. It's scary because it's obviously incredibly destructive, and should those um, you know missiles ever be used, I think it's probably fair to say that the world's heading towards oblivion anyway. But it's a timely reminder because it is saying to the world, uh, America's not the only show in town, and it is incumbent upon all countries with incredible destructive power to also play a much more responsible role in dealing with conflicts in the world. Stop fueling them and find solutions to them.
So we've got the Sarmat and the Dongfeng now that outmatch their American counterparts in destructive
Yeah.
power, and both of those countries seem to be trying to. Russia and China are both trying to reset or at least demonstrate that they're a more responsible partner, nuclear partner to the globe in the process. So was there also stability? Was the object of this to also project to the world stability against what's on offer from Washington at the moment?
I think that came from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization a lot more than from the military parade per se. I mean, the military parade obviously had participants from countries that were affected, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting really was the one that sent clear signals to the world that a large group of countries that had originally formed around questions of security, whether it was terrorism, extremism, and separatism, is now maturing those relationships to support transcontinental economic collaboration and infrastructure development in ways that position these countries well and truly out of the reach of malevolent Western powers. And those and the SCO has grown over the last 20 odd years from an organization of six to an organization with over 20. So again, it shows this ability to advance um, international collaboration and coordination in a systemic and patient way, right? Very much focused on consolidating the relationships between the participating members, not because they've got an external enemy, but interestingly enough, because they've got shared internal risks, and those risks are the risks of extremism, the risks of separatism, which seeks to pull countries apart, and the risks of terrorism, which is non-state violence. And all of these countries have had their fair share of exposure to these risks, and through enhanced cooperation and coordination, information, and those sorts of things, they're able to um, uh, bring some, to one extent or another, bring some calmness to their own body politic, which lays the foundations then for other things to be pursued, economic development and whatnot. So I think the SCO probably played a more important role from a global stability messaging perspective than the military parade itself. The military parade was what it was. It was firstly a celebration of 80 years and a recognition of China's own sacrifices in the war against fascism, but it was clearly also a presentation of current and future capability. Um,
Well, the reason I sort of wanted to explore that was because the way the West is looking at this, you're hearing the term crink being used, China, Russia, India, and North Korea. There were a few photo opportunities out the front there where, the Western media was critiquing the placement of those world leaders on the bloody red carpet and things like that, and trying to pick at the significance of having these leaders side by side. And also at the SEO, that there was a large bilateral deal secured between Russia and China for gas and hydrocarbons. So I just would like to ask you before we move on, what's the reality of these relationships for Beijing, and the importance of them, and how do they play into the calculations for China's future? Are they very significant and enduring relationships, or are they, pieces on the chessboard that are moving around in the short to middle term?
well, the DPRK, North Korea, and China have a mutual defense treaty. Again, it's been in place now for 70 years
Yeah.
plus. And uh, it's one of the few. In fact, it may even be the only defense treaty that China's a signatory to. So it's not unimportant. The second thing is that the Korean Peninsula, particularly with a nuclear capable DPRK, is not a force to be taken lightly, and it's not one to, or the situation on the Korean Peninsula is one to be treated with an incredible amount of care and respect. So, the idea that somehow a neighbor and a treaty signatory with whom you also fought a significant war, the Korean War in the 50s, is not involved in regional security related things seems to be a little bit far-fetched. And perhaps United States would rather an incredibly destabilized North Korean peninsula as a thorn in China's side. But it's in China's long-term interest for the Korean peninsula to be stabilized. It's also in the interests of the people who live in the southern half of the Korean peninsula as well. And it's also in the interest of people who live in Japan. And so um, Northeast Asia is one that commands attention and respect. The other thing to bear in mind is that earlier this year, the DPRK and Russia also signed off on some strategic agreements. And so it's no surprise that, and we now know that some DPRK military personnel also fought the Ukrainian army in Russia. So again, it's not particularly surprising at a military parade that these countries, who are neighbours and who had a bunch of shared military experiences, would come together. Okay.
So
Um,
this indicates that they're really not, there's no signaling going on to the West anymore. This is a signal to the world around the West. It's kind of like, it feels like a bit of the elephant's in the room, and a lot of people are kind of walking around it now and moving into another room almost when it comes to the West and the optics that China has been so careful with in the past.
yeah, look, China's position, I guess, as they articulate it, is one that these relationships are forged to advance the interests of the participants. They're not directed at any non-participating third parties. So they are aimed at enhancing the economic relationships between, for example, Russia and China. They are aimed at enhancing the security relationship that exists between Russia and China, and also China and the DPRK. Those relationships are important because they also contribute to China's ability to do what it seeks to do to promote uh, at least stability on the Korean Peninsula, but also with a longer term view of being able to ultimately resolve the tensions on the North Korean Peninsula. China maintains relationships with, well, it has 14 land neighbours, right?
Mm.
And unsurprisingly, with 14 land neighbours, it has its work cut out. It needs to and has put in the effort it must do to stabilise its peripheries and to also have relationships with its neighbouring countries that contribute to, at a minimum, stability, but preferably contributes to the development economically, in particular, of China and its neighboring countries, because as its neighboring countries develop, so too does China benefit. So China, I think, takes a much more holistic view about this question of its own security interests, and sees them largely in economic terms. Insofar as the military question comes into it, China today is quite clearly capable of defending itself. Um, and we now get commentary from some quarters in the West after the parade, grudgingly conceding the advancements that China's made in terms of its military hardware, but with the throwaway line that, well, none of it's ever, the Chinese army's never been battle tested. Well, that's the point. I mean, I'm not sure, what the claim to fame is. If your claim to fame is that, well, my army's been battle tested, well, it just means that you're in a lot of wars. And if your army's been battle tested in wars nowhere near your own homeland, then you've got to wonder why. Right? All it tells us is that the Americans have been belligerents for decade upon decade. And if that's their claim to fame, that's a little bit sad.
And there's
Um,
two types of battle testing as well, and the one that America ascribes to is asymmetrical, battle testing in some, poor country, whereas Russia's experienced what, battle testing can do when it's sort of applied to 3 years of half a continental war going on in Ukraine,
yeah.
and
Look,
the
the other
difference is
thing with
stark.
yeah, it is stark. And look, the other thing to bear in mind is that China's military is the largest contributor, personnel-wise, over 50% to United Nations peacekeeping missions. So it's not like people aren't battle tested in terms of being in the field dealing with risk environments, right, where life and death is at stake. But again, look, I just don't think that that this idea of battle testing is something that one should wear with pride. I think it
It's
actually says that your diplomacy has failed, and that you have pursued an aggressive military posture in parts of the world that clearly don't directly impinge on your own national security. And I mean, if that's the claim to fame from the Americans in particular, then that's a little bit sad for them. And arguably, of course, as a consequence, sad for those parts of the world that have been victims of American military intervention.
Yeah, and in a world with billions of dollars of legacy aircraft carriers and hypersonic missiles, potentially battle testing and those sort of terms aren't quite accurate right now. I mean, what is a modern army going to do in a large scale war right now? It's not going to be fighting in any kind of conceivable framework of what came before. And yeah, China's probably been gaming its systems just as much as America has about how it can fight a future war and building technologies accordingly. So it's going to be a different future anyway.
Yeah.
Before we pivot to the SEO, and I know I've only got you for a bit longer, I just sort of wanted to maybe point out, like we saw pictures. I thought the highlight of the anniversary parade was Prabowo just looking slick. He almost had a bit of a smirk on his face, and he seemed to be enjoying himself a little bit. And I want to just ask you briefly how the presence of Indonesia embracing multipolarism quite openly at the moment, and how that kind of conflicts with Australia's stance at the moment, which is kind of a bit multipolar phobic, I suppose.
Yeah, Indonesia became a full member of BRICS earlier this year. And also in the last week or so, the Central Bank of Indonesia and the Central Bank of China, People's Bank of China, arrived at an agreement on direct digitalized cross-border payments systems frameworks, which the two banks expect to be fully operational by the end of this year. What that's going to mean is that Indonesian companies and individuals and Chinese individuals and companies will be able to make direct payments with QR codes. Right? That's not an insignificant institutional and technical accomplishment.
And
Clearly,
sorry, Warwick, does this bypass like third-party banking systems
yeah,
essentially, right? Yeah.
yeah. So Indonesia is the largest nation state member of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It has over 300 million people, and it is, aside from Singapore, I guess you'd say it's the largest economy. It's a significant um, uh, nation and economy within our region, um, with the possibilities of over the next half century um, becoming a major power in its own right. Right? It's not a small place. It's a serious country, uh, and uh, and it has, of course, as a result of that, played a very important role in the politics of Southeast Asia, broadly speaking, because in some regards, uh, Indonesia has been the bellwether for how ASEAN countries ultimately, move. That's not to say that Indonesia dictates to other member states. In fact, far from it. That's not how ASEAN does its business. But because of its heft within the region, other countries pay a lot of attention to what Indonesia says and does. So this is an important um, signal, if you will, from Indonesia that it sees itself as very much a part of the region and that China is an important, if not a dominant part of the region. It is going to have strong bilateral relationships with China, but also it is capable of having playing an important role in multilateral institutions in which China is engaged, such as ASEAN. So I think the presence of the Indonesian president in China, and look, you've got to bear in mind too that he actually left the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, went back to Indonesia because of the demonstrations and riots there, and then took an early morning flight back to Beijing to attend the military parade.
Wow.
So he was clearly committed to attending. The other thing too is let's not forget that Moscow was actually the first place he visited when he became president. So um,
We fly so blind about this, Warwick, in Australia. It's the biggest blind spot, I think, in our regional perspective, where Indonesia stands in reality, contrasting with us. And it's
uh,
ultimately, is it ultimately destined for more tension, those two conflicting standpoints?
I don't think it necessarily is because I think Indonesia is Indonesia lives and embodies the Bandung spirit, which is a non-aligned spirit, a spirit of neutrality, which in many ways is not a passive position in between, one side or another, but it's actually a proactive position which transcends, the A versus B dynamic that often shapes the way we think about the world. So Indonesia is in an historically unique position to contribute to a kind of Asia over the course of the next 20 to 50 years that reflects a multipolarity ethos rather than one that is trapped by uh, the dynamics of China-US relationships. And the question for Australia really is the extent to which it wants to be a more active contributor to a multipolar or a multilateral Southeast Asia, or whether it will hold on to its position as an American sub-imperial ally for as long as it possibly can. And a lot of that is going to hinge on, firstly, how Australia thinks the United States' role within Asia is going to evolve, and also, of course, the reality of how the United States' role in Asia evolves.
Yeah, totally. And it makes the way you make it sound there, having a non-aligned, Bandung principled sort of nation next to us is probably a good thing. Where we're looking at a great power struggle in the region, and we're seeing India, another non-aligned country, coming to the table somewhat, and we even see the remnants of non-aligned mentality going on with, say, Serbia and things like countries like that. So yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I just wanted to touch on the Shanghai cooperation meeting that we spoke about earlier, and there were just some incredible developments that sort of came out of that meeting, around the clean energy, where Beijing has essentially agreed to bankroll five nations, the green energy of five nations within the group. Could you explain a little bit about the significance of that? And it's so underreported in the West, these kind of these massive Eurasian economic steps that seem to be making. Sooner or later we're going to turn around and Kazakhstan's going to make Australia look like a drop in the ocean. And it's incredible to see the development happening there. And yeah, could you just sort of explain a little bit how big that is, what it means? And look, just, maybe if we could add something on top, can Australia get a sniff of any of this? Because it seems like something that's really important and would suit our national interest ultimately.
Energy is the bedrock or the substrate of social and economic development. Economic systems are basically energy systems. In fact, societies are basically energy systems as well, right? I often say that functional societies are ones in which there is plenty of food for people and there's plenty of fuel for machines. The ways in which human beings harness available energy in the universe has, of course, changed over time. And humans have discovered more energy efficient ways of accessing latent or dormant energy that exists in the universe. So the idea that we use to describe this is the energy return on energy invested. How much energy has to be committed to gain access to another amount of energy? And successful societies are ones in which they can continue to access more energy return on energy invested opportunities. As certain kinds of energies become more difficult to access, of course, you've got to commit more and more energy to get the next unit out, right? So that's your diminishing returns on energy invested. And if you remain committed to that path, you end up experiencing a reduction in the amount of surplus energy that you have in your social system for the things that you might care about. So economic development is underpinned by energy. And in an environment where questions of national security are rearing their heads, food security and energy sovereignty are central to the ability of nation states to pursue their own developmental ambitions. Some nation states have the benefit of having access to lots of um, uh, carbon-based energy, right? Whether it's coal or whether we have access to gas, oil, and things like that. Some still have plenty of that stuff available, right? So, Russia, for example, still has vast reservoirs of fossil fuels available as stored energy, created over millions and millions of years, that can be accessed with relatively low energy investments. But not every country has that. And so countries need to look to other kinds of energy sources for their ability to develop. China, over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, has developed renewable energy capabilities, not just renewable energy. China's also a leader now in, solar, in nuclear and other things too, right? And of course,
Thorium reactors.
thorium reactors, and of course, coal-fired power stations in China continue to be approved and are being developed as well. Some are being decommissioned, but newer ones are coming on to replace it. So China has a complete energy mix. But one of the things China is obviously very good at now and is leading the world in is wind, solar, and battery technologies. Batteries are important in this mix because one of the constraints of renewable energies is intermittency. It's not available all the time, and it's not always available when you want it. And so you need to have a way of storing electricity or energy when it has been captured so that you can use it when and where you want. So battery technology has been long-standing constraint, and China has, in many regards, punched through the chemical and technological constraints on that front as well, and continues to lead the world in various forms of battery technologies, which will make the integrated systems, renewable energy plus storage systems, even more cost effective. By committing to financing these sorts of energy projects across the Eurasian continent, it's achieving a number of objectives in one go. One is, of course, it is enabling its own capabilities to be exported. So that's good for its own industries. Secondly, it is enabling these countries across the region to become energy independent and achieve levels of economic development which they would otherwise not have. By doing that, they will become wealthier and will then also engage in more trade with China. Wealthier nations will, particularly on China's border, from China's point of view, will also more than likely be more stable countries, more stable neighbors. Poor countries are, uh, high risk, politically unstable places. So you want your neighbors to actually get wealthier anyway, because that's actually good for your own security. Um, and and last but not least, of course, so as you unfold this, you're also creating the flywheel of economic development, which then picks up on other things, downstream from energy.
Mm.
So, for example, once you have low cost renewable energy, you also unlock the possibilities of hydrogen. Hydrogen uh, really comes into its own once its production costs become negligible, and you only do that with uh, you know very very low cost renewable energy. And once you have hydrogen available, it's a great downstream energy source for all sorts of industrial applications that renewables and batteries themselves are not well suited to. So again, it keeps opening up new possibilities. So that's a very significant part. The other part of the energy story coming out of the SCO is the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline agreement between Russia and China. It's significant because it obviously sees a redirection of potential gas from Western European markets to China in time, um, at arguably at great opportunity cost to the Europeans,
Mm.
and it also again ties the strategic interests of China and Russia together. But interestingly, one of the areas of contention was the pipeline route, and it's going to go through Mongolia now. And as a transit country for this pipeline, it also brings Mongolia to the table, um, as which enables its interests to be, I think, also taken into account, both from a security and economic development point of view.
I
And
saw some pretty happy photos with the Mongolian government there, so they seem to be pretty impressed with the deal.
well, I'd be happy if I was them too, right? Because uh, they become, well, they get a seat at the table. They
Yeah.
become, participants in this process. Whereas if the pipeline went around them, you know, it they're not party to it. Now, being party to it opens up opportunities. One, obviously, is to be engaged in, well, there's revenues to be gained, transit fees. But perhaps there will also be offtake opportunities as well, that could be beneficial to Mongolia. But certainly from a security point of view and being a key player um, at, on the table, at the table, sitting at the table, is a desirable outcome. So certainly, I think the Mongolians are happy, the Russians are happy, and the Chinese are happy. Um, uh, there are people in Europe who actually understand the implications of all of this, Joel, but Brussels cannot concede that they're not happy about this. But this is quite a devastating outcome from a Western European point of view.
And that goes back to the ideological kind of liberal elite mindset versus the realist, the emerging realist mindset that is increasingly becoming more important, especially in the West, to hold. Uh, which like hearing about this pipeline coming through, it seems like there's some enduring kind of relationships. This is more than kind of circumstantial strange bedfellows kind of stuff. These are pipelines, these are infrastructure, these are circuitry that's being fused and soldered on to the region. And I want to ask you, just I know I always want to ask you heaps more questions, and you got to go, but the One Belt One Road seemed to be a little bit, it came in that wolf warrior diplomacy era and had a lot of ambition. Now, is there a bit of hedging going on here potentially with the SEO ultimately, and is the future, the eggs in this basket now, so what to speak, or is the dream of the One Belt One Road still alive?
It's very much alive. Let's not forget that the Belt and Road Initiative, as it's now called, um, was launched in 2013 in Central Asia. Okay, so uh, the continental Silk Road, which connected China to Europe through Eurasia, um, was the inspiration, if you will. So, in that regard, the Belt and Road Initiative is actually the longer term feature. The second thing is that this past 12 months has seen the Belt and Road Initiative, or projects funded through the Belt and Road Initiative, blossom. In fact, China's committed more funds in the last 12 months to a range of Belt and Road Initiative related projects than it had done for a couple of years prior, from memory. So the Belt and Road Initiative continues to be an important part of China's own strategic framing
All
of.
the way to Brussels. I mean, it'll get to Serbia, no problem. But do you think, like as you said, in Europe, there are some people that actually know what's going on and they're quite terrified of it? Are they hoping that BRI sort of ends up in Western Europe?
Well, Italy was, of course, a signatory but then withdrew last year or the year before. Now I can't remember. Time flies, right? So hard to keep track of time. Um, but at the moment, I think you would say that Hungary represents from the point of view of a member state of the European Union, Hungary represents the destination point, or the
The node.
gateway
Yep.
point to the Belt and Road. Hungary itself has actually just concluded a very successful panda bond round, where it issued bonds denominated in the RMB. Right, so it's raising RMB to boost its foreign reserves, and, uh, and so it is going to become more entangled with the Chinese economy into the next 5 years than it has in the past 5 years. And that's saying something, because Hungary has been, over the last couple of years at least, the largest destination for Chinese outbound foreign direct investment into Western Europe.
Last question, Warwick. With Washington so discombobulated, with, as you said, the Secretary of War moving out and banging a war drum now, and then, Besant and Lutnick just kind of speaking all sorts of rambling. And then we're seeing these, as I said, the circuitry and these kind of pipelines being laid in a region just above us. Geographically so close. We're seeing Indonesia interface with this new world and our neighbors. What is this, that ideological versus realism that constantly competes within, say, Canberra as well? With this relationship with the US at a generational low, how does this rub off in Canberra, do you think? And, is there a future for a pragmatic, realist, sovereign outlook that can sort of interface with this, opportunity?
I think there is a future for that. I mean, but clearly there's a debate happening at the moment in Australia, and there are different views about both the state of the world as it is today, and also what the likely state of the world is over the next 10 to 20 years. Set against all of that backdrop, of course, is this sort of normative dimension as well, which is what should or shouldn't it be. But a lot of what will happen, I think, from an Australian point of view, will actually hinge less on what Australia does and a lot more on what Washington does. I'm often asked about, whether the view of the world in Canberra is going to change, whether it's in relation to China or whatever. And I say, look, it'll change when the view of all of these things in Washington changes. And
We have to
and
be abandoned by another empire left at the train station with our teddy bear crying. That's the only way we're going to come to any sense. Is that what you're saying?
well, there is a part of the Australian body politic, or political institutions, that I think instinctively, historical muscle memory, are going to cling on to what they know for as long as they possibly can. Others have moved on, right? So Professor Hugh White, for example, I guess arguably is the thinker who um, uh, moved on long before anyone else. So his view, in essence, and one that I tend to agree with, is that the era of American primacy in Asia is over. Um, uh, and Australia is simply going to need to adjust to a world in which it can no longer rely on America as a security partner, and it must then adapt and contribute to the development of multipolar institutions or multilateral institutions in Asia that reflects these new realities. Others accept that this is the trend, but perhaps hope to slow it down. And then there are those who are desperately working overtime to do whatever they can to contribute to what in their mind is the rejuvenation of American primacy in the region, because that's how they view Australian interests. I think what's happening in the United States is also a bit of a debate as to the extent to which the US is committed to Asia, given resource constraints. So the debate was the United States really has a priority in Asia and it can't commit to Europe. So that was phase one, and that's been unfolding. Now it seems that there is a debate happening in the War Department, in the Pentagon, as to whether or not, in fact, the United States has the capability to be fully committed to Asia, given that it also has priorities directly on the home front. If it's not fully committed to Asia, there are some people who would say that this represents a retreat. I'm a bit reluctant to go that far because it seems to me that what's happening at the moment is that the US, like it's done in Europe, is not retreating per se, but it's engaging in some retrenchment, which is really taking half a step back, pushing its partners to the front, and in essence saying to its partners and its allies, you pay for it and you do the heavy lifting and you stand on the front line. And well, we're kind of here. So the concern in Europe is that, in fact, the US isn't there on the backstop. The question in Australia also is emerging, which is, can Australia depend on the US? And even if it could, the other question that's being asked is whether, in fact, the US has the capacity to deliver anyway. And this question's being raised in other parts of Asia, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in Korea, whether it's on the island of Taiwan, and to some extent also on the Philippines. The very serious question is, even if America wanted to, the question is can it really make a difference? And there are analysts who, and I guess I'd count myself amongst them, who reached the conclusion a little while back that that the United States is no longer in a position in straight down the line material terms to impose itself in the way that it perhaps wanted to in the past. And that's also a reality that won't change. And countries need to adapt to that. Now, there are people, with a Western sort of experience who are very, very displaced by that, racked by anxiety, chronically displaced. The idea that the US won't be the primary player in the Asia region, and what that might mean for a place like Australia. I think that's a little bit unfortunate because I think Australia actually does have a part of its body politic and its political culture and its social outlook and as well as its material capability for it to imagine and contribute to a very different Asia, but one in which Australia can play a constructive role in not only creating but sustaining these multilateral, neutral institutions that contribute to regional stability and peace. I think Australia can play that kind of role if it so wishes to, but it can't do that so long as it wants to hedge and hold on to the prospects that American primacy can be rejuvenated.
Looks like we need another kick in the pants, Warwick, and a bit of a wake up call. Yeah, it's mind blowing kind of outcome to think that we're so close but so far away with so many things. And yeah, some of these orthodoxies are starting to get a little bit old, and I'm hoping with time, just like yourself, that some of these people like Hugh White are gonna, yeah, kind of rise back up to prominence, and we can start having these conversations in the mainstream a little bit more, because I think there's an appetite for them, if we just sort of not getting them enough. And I think there's an understanding too that there has been a shift, that the security umbrella isn't quite as warm, or as dry as we thought it would be. And yeah, that there might be some other options out there. So I'm glad to be exploring them with you as always, Warwick. And thank you very much for joining us again.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you, Joel.
Cheers, mate.